The day the civilized world died. The Bronze Age collapse. The Golden Age of Bronze. Imagine a world deeply interconnected by trade, diplomacy, and technology. A world where a king in Greece can send a letter to a pharaoh in Egypt complaining that a shipment of gold from a merchant in the Middle East was slightly underweight. A world where elite societies share art, royal marriages, and military alliances, constructing massive stone monuments that still baffle modern engineers. Now, imagine that within the span of just 1 or 2 generations, this entire world completely vanishes. The grand palaces are burned to ash. The trade routes fall silent. The secret of writing itself is forgotten. Empires that had stood for 1,000 years collapse so violently that their names are erased from human memory for millennia. This isn't the plot of a dystopian sci-fi movie. This actually happened. Around the year 1177 BCE, the Mediterranean world experienced the most profound, sudden, and mysterious cataclysm in human history. We call it the Bronze Age collapse. To understand how it happened and why it matters to us today, we first have to look at the world that was lost. In the year 1300 BCE, the Late Bronze Age was at its absolute peak. It was a globalized economy, centuries before anyone even coined the word globalization. If you were to map out the superpowers of this era, you would see a complex web of rivaling yet deeply codependent empires. In the south, you had the new kingdom of Egypt, wealthy, arrogant, and heavily militarized under the rule of great pharaohs like Ramses II. To the north, in modern-day Turkey, stood the Hittite Empire, a terrifying military machine famous for its advanced ironworking and deadly chariot divisions. To the east lay Babylon and the Assyrians, controlling the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia. And to the west, across the Aegean Sea, were the Mycenaean Greeks, the legendary wealthy kings of Agamemnon and Achilles, ruling from heavily fortified citadels like Mycenae and Tiryns. For centuries, these empires fought, traded, and gossiped. We know this because archaeologists dug up the Amarna letters, a treasure trove of clay tablets containing the actual diplomatic correspondence between these ancient rulers. Reading them feels like reading a group chat between modern world leaders. They call each other "my brother." They exchange extravagant gifts, lapis lazuli, silver, exotic animals. They negotiate tariffs. They even complain when the gifts aren't expensive enough. But beneath this glittering golden facade of civilization lay a fatal flaw, a vulnerability so massive that it eventually brought the entire system crashing down. And that vulnerability was bronze itself. To understand the Bronze Age, you have to understand the technology. Bronze was the oil of the ancient world. It was the material used for everything that mattered: swords, shields, armor, plowshares, and tools. If you didn't have bronze, you were stuck in the Stone Age, ready to be conquered by someone who did. But making bronze is not easy. It is an alloy, requiring 2 specific ingredients, roughly 90% copper and 10% tin. Now, copper was relatively easy to find. The island of Cyprus was practically made of it. In fact, the word copper comes from the Greek word kypros. But tin? Tin was incredibly rare. In the entire Mediterranean basin, there was almost no tin to be found. To get tin, Bronze Age merchants had to launch massive, perilous trade expeditions across thousands of miles. They had to go to the mountains of modern-day Afghanistan, or all the way to the edges of the known world in Cornwall, Britain. Think about the sheer logistical nightmare of this. A Mycenaean king in Greece could not build an army unless a merchant successfully transported tin from Afghanistan through Mesopotamia, across the Syrian desert, onto a ship in Canaan and across the pirate-infested Mediterranean Sea to Greece, where it would finally be melted down with copper from Cyprus. This meant that every single superpower was utterly dependent on international trade routes staying open. It was a hyper-connected, just-in-time supply chain. If a war broke out in Syria, or if pirates closed a shipping lane in the Aegean, the supply of tin stopped. If the tin stopped, bronze production stopped. If bronze production stopped, an empire could no longer defend its borders or harvest its crops. For a long time, the system worked because the empires kept each other in check. But around 1200 BCE, something shifted. The planet itself seemed to turn against them. According to recent scientific data, including the study of ancient pollen samples, lake sediments, and tree rings, the Mediterranean was hit by a brutal, prolonged climate shift. It was a mega drought that lasted for decades, perhaps even a century. Imagine the panic. Year after year, the rains failed. The Nile didn't flood. The crops withered in the fields of Anatolia and Greece. In a world without modern food preservation or global supermarkets, a bad harvest didn't just mean higher prices. It meant mass starvation. We have physical evidence of this desperation preserved in clay. In the ruins of the Hittite capital of Hattusa, archaeologists found a letter sent to the king of Egypt. The Hittite king writes with a sense of raw urgency. It is a matter of life and death. There is no grain in our lands. Egypt, which had a bit more food security thanks to the Nile, sent shipfuls of grain to save their neighbors. But it was a temporary band-aid on a gaping wound. As the famine worsened, the social fabric began to tear. Peasants and farmers, starving and desperate, looked at their royal elites living in luxury inside their massive stone palaces. They began to wonder why they were paying taxes to kings who couldn't even pray to the gods well enough to make it rain. And just when the empires were at their weakest, starving, economically crippled, and socially unstable, a new threat appeared on the horizon. Out of the misty waters of the Mediterranean came a terror that the ancient world was completely unprepared for. As the great empires of the late Bronze Age staggered under the weight of famine and economic ruin, the rulers looked out to the horizon, and what they saw filled them with absolute terror. Out of the Mediterranean Sea came hundreds, then thousands of ships. They carried not merchants looking for trade, but entire nations on the move. Warriors, women, children, and livestock packed into vessels, fleeing their own ruined homelands. The ancient Egyptians simply called them the foreigners of the sea, or more famously to modern historians, the Sea Peoples. Who were they? Where did they come from? For over a century, this has been one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. They weren't a single unified army or a single empire. Instead, they were a loose, shifting coalition of different seafaring tribes. Egyptian inscriptions identify several of these groups by name. There were the Peleset, whom we know today as the Philistines from the Bible. There were the Shardana, fierce warriors who wore distinctive horned helmets and carried long, straight swords. Many historians believe they eventually settled on and gave their name to the island of Sardinia. There were the Luca, notorious pirates from the rugged coasts of southwestern Turkey, and the Denyen, who might have been linked to the early Greeks. The Sea Peoples were not just raiders who struck a village and sailed away with gold. They were something far more dangerous: migrant invaders. Driven out of their homes in Europe and the Western Mediterranean by the same droughts and famines that were crippling the Middle East, they had nothing left to lose. They were looking for a new place to live, and they were willing to burn down the old world to get it. And their style of warfare was revolutionary. For centuries, Bronze Age warfare had been dominated by the chariot. Chariots were the fighter jets of the ancient world. They were incredibly expensive, high-tech machines operated by a wealthy, highly trained military elite. If you had more chariots than your enemy, you won the war. But the Sea Peoples brought a violent end to the era of chariot warfare. They fought on foot, utilizing light armor, round shields, and deadly javelins. They swarmed the heavy, clunky chariots, throwing javelins at the horses and cutting down the drivers. It was cheap, asymmetric warfare. A swarm of low-tech infantry was suddenly annihilating the multi-million-dollar military investments of the great kings. To see just how fast and brutal this destruction was, we have to look at the tragic story of Ugarit. Ugarit was a glittering, ultra-wealthy coastal metropolis in modern-day Syria. It was the financial hub of the ancient world, a city filled with multilingual merchants, massive warehouses, and grand palaces. But in the late 13th century BCE, the Sea Peoples approached. Archaeologists excavating the ruins of Ugarit found something truly haunting. In the ovens of the city's scribes, they discovered a series of clay tablets that had been baked by the very fires that destroyed the city. These tablets are the final, desperate cries for help from a dying civilization. In one letter, the king of Ugarit writes to the king of Cyprus, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does my father not know that all my troops and chariots are in the Hittite country, and all my ships are in the Lycian coast? Thus the country is abandoned to itself." In another tablet, which was never even mailed, an official writes, "When your messenger arrived, the army was already humiliated, and the city was sacked. Our food in the threshing floors was burnt, and the vineyards were also destroyed. Our city is sacked. May you know it." Ugarit was completely wiped off the map. It was burned so thoroughly that it was never rebuilt. One by one, the dominoes began to fall. The coastal cities of Canaan were obliterated. The Hittite Empire's ports were cut off. The invaders were moving like a locust swarm, burning everything in their path, heading south toward the wealthiest prize of all. By the year 1175 BCE, the Sea Peoples had reached the borders of Egypt. The pharaoh at the time was Ramses III. He knew that if Egypt fell, human civilization in the Mediterranean would essentially end. Ramses III mobilized every single able-bodied man in Egypt. He fortified the coastlines and turned the Nile Delta into a massive trap. He wrote in his victory inscriptions, "I upholstered the river mouths like a strong wall with warships, galleys, and skiffs. Those who came forward together on the sea, a full flame was before them at the river mouths." The clash that followed is known as the Battle of the Delta, and it was one of the most critical military engagements in human history. The Sea People's ships entered the narrow, shallow channels of the Nile Delta. They were sailing ships designed for the open ocean. But inside the tight river channels, there was no wind. Their ships stalled. That was exactly what Ramses was waiting for. Egyptian archers lined the shores, raining thousands of deadly arrows down upon the trapped invaders. Then, the Egyptian navy, which used oars and was highly maneuverable in shallow waters, charged. They used grappling hooks to capsize the enemy ships and pulled the heavily armored Sea Peoples into the water to drown. Those who made it to the shore were slaughtered by the waiting Egyptian infantry. Egypt won. Ramses III saved his empire from total annihilation. To celebrate, he carved massive, detailed reliefs of the battle onto the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. The effort had utterly bankrupted Egypt. The treasury was empty. The trade routes were shattered. And the world outside of Egypt's borders was already gone. While Egypt survived the initial shockwave, the rest of the civilized world had just collapsed into ash. While Egypt was busy celebrating its bloody victory in the Nile Delta, the rest of the Mediterranean world was burning. The victory of Ramses III couldn't stop the chain reaction that had already been set in motion. The Bronze Age world was so tightly interconnected that when one major player fell, it didn't just leave a vacuum. It pulled everyone else down with it. This was the ultimate historical domino effect. And the next domino to fall was the mighty Hittite Empire. For over 500 years, the Hittites had ruled the rugged plateaus of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. They were masters of bureaucracy, diplomacy, and warfare. Their capital city, Hattusa, was a marvel of ancient engineering. It was surrounded by miles of massive, double-layered stone walls, punctuated by monumental gates like the famous Lion's Gate. It was designed to withstand any siege. Yet around 1180 BCE, Hattusa was utterly destroyed. For a long time, historians assumed that the Sea Peoples simply marched up into the mountains and sacked the city. But recent archaeological excavations have revealed a much more complicated and terrifying story. When archaeologists carefully analyzed the layers of ash in Hattusa, they made a shocking discovery. The entire city didn't burn. The outer civilian areas, the lower towns, and the residential quarters showed almost no signs of warfare. Instead, the fires were highly selective. Only the royal palaces, the government archive buildings, and the main religious temples were systematically torched. What does this mean? It means the threat didn't just come from the outside. The threat was already inside the walls. Crippled by decades of famine and cut off from international trade by the Sea Peoples, the Hittite government could no longer feed its population or pay its soldiers. The social contract was broken. The starving peasants and lower classes rose up in a violent, bloody revolution, burning down the symbols of the royal elite who had failed them. The Hittite Empire didn't just get conquered, it imploded from within. Meanwhile, across the Aegean Sea, a similar nightmare was unfolding in Mycenaean Greece. This was the Greece of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, a land of wealthy, militaristic kings who ruled from heavily fortified hilltop citadels like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. These kings were obsessed with control. They kept meticulous administrative records on clay tablets using a script called Linear B. They recorded every single sheep, every jar of olive oil, and every bronze sword in their tax ledgers. But between 1200 and 1150 BCE, nearly every single Mycenaean palace was violently destroyed, abandoned, or burned to the ground. At the site of Pylos, on the southwestern coast of Greece, the clay tablets captured the sheer panic of the final days. The scribes were frantically recording the deployment of coastal watchers to look out for incoming enemy ships. One of the last tablets ever baked in Pylos records a desperate sacrifice of gold and human lives to the gods, praying for a miracle. The miracle never came. Pylos was burned to ash days later. With the destruction of the palaces, Greek civilization didn't just decline, it suffered complete amnesia. Because literacy was confined entirely to the royal palace bureaucrats, when the palaces burned, the secret of writing was completely lost. Greece entered a 400-year period known as the Greek Dark Ages. During this Dark Age, the population plummeted by up to 75%. Major cities turned into ghost towns. The grand stone architecture vanished. replaced by simple mud brick huts. The art of fresco painting, stone carving, and sophisticated trade disappeared. The Greeks forgot how to read and write so thoroughly that when literacy finally returned 4 centuries later, they had to invent a completely new alphabet, borrowed from the Phoenicians. The collapse was total, global, and seemingly unstoppable. Modern historians call this phenomenon a hypercoherent system collapse. Think of it like the 2008 global financial crisis or a modern pandemic supply chain failure, but amplified 1,000 times. In a hyper-connected world, empires rely on specialization. Greece exported wine and olive oil. Cyprus exported copper. Canaan exported grain. Afghanistan exported tin. When the sea peoples disrupted the shipping lanes, the trade network shattered. Suddenly, Greece couldn't sell its oil, so its economy crashed. Because its economy crashed, it couldn't buy grain from Canaan. Because Canaan couldn't sell its grain, its cities went bankrupt. Because everyone was bankrupt and starving, internal rebellions broke out. It wasn't just the sea peoples. It wasn't just the drought. It wasn't just the earthquakes or the internal civil wars. It was all of it, happening everywhere, all at once. The very complexity that made the Bronze Age civilization so great became its fatal flaw. The system was too big, too rigid, and too interconnected to survive a multivariable crisis. The civilized world didn't just stumble, it fell off a cliff. And as the smoke cleared over the charred ruins of the Mediterranean, humanity found itself standing in the ashes of a forgotten golden age. When a global system collapses, the immediate aftermath is not a quick recovery. It is a long, slow, and painful silence. As the 11th century BCE began, the Mediterranean basin was unrecognizable. The grand, glittering network of superpowers was gone. In its place stood a scarred landscape of ruined cities, abandoned fields, and fractured societies trying to survive in a brave new world. The ultimate survivor, of course, was Egypt. By successfully repelling the sea peoples, Egypt had managed to keep its political structure intact. The pharaohs still sat on the throne in Thebes, the priests still performed rituals in the temples, and the Nile still flooded every year. But Egypt's survival was an illusion. The Bronze Age collapse had fundamentally broken Egypt's geopolitical standing. With the destruction of the Hittites and the collapse of the trade hubs in Canaan and Syria, Egypt was completely isolated. They no longer had international partners to trade with. The gold mines of Nubia were running dry, and the treasury was severely depleted from the massive military spending required to survive the invasions. This economic desperation led to one of the most fascinating and scandalous periods in Egyptian history, the era of state-sanctioned tomb robbing. During the New Kingdom, pharaohs had been buried in the Valley of the Kings with unimaginable wealth, tons of gold, silver, and precious jewels. But as the Egyptian economy collapsed in the generations following Ramses III, the government could no longer pay its workers, artisans, or soldiers. The Royal Necropolis Guards went on strike, the first recorded labor strikes in human history. To keep the government afloat, subsequent pharaohs began to quietly authorize the recycling of royal tombs. Officials would enter the ancient tombs of legendary kings, strip the gold from the mummies, melt it down into currency, and rebury the pharaohs in mass hidden caches to protect what was left. The grand superpower of Egypt had been reduced to robbing its own dead ancestors just to pay its bills. By the mid-11th century BCE, Egypt fractured. The high priests of Amun took control of the south, while the pharaohs ruled a weakened north from the city of Tanis. Egypt's golden age was over. It would spend the next 1,000 years being conquered and dominated by foreign empires, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, and finally, the Romans. But while the old giants were dying, something incredible was happening in the shadows of the ruins. The destruction of the great empires had done something revolutionary. It leveled the playing field. For centuries, the Hittites, Egyptians, and Mycenaeans had maintained a strict monopoly on power, trade, and technology. Small, independent cultures never stood a chance. They were always swallowed up or heavily taxed by the superpowers. But with the superpowers gone, the forgotten underdogs of the ancient world finally had room to breathe, innovate, and grow. The first major innovation was born out of pure necessity: the Iron Age. As we established, making bronze required a complex international supply chain to get tin. When that supply chain collapsed, smiths could no longer make bronze weapons or tools. They had to find an alternative. And they found it right beneath their feet. Iron ore was incredibly common. It was everywhere. However, working with iron was much harder than working with bronze. It required much higher melting temperatures and complex forging techniques that ancient blacksmiths hadn't perfected. But with no tin available, smiths were forced to experiment. Over decades of trial and error, they mastered the art of smelting iron and infusing it with carbon to create steel. Suddenly, weapons and tools weren't just for the wealthy royal elites anymore. Iron was cheap, abundant, and stronger than bronze. For the first time in history, regular farmers could afford iron plows, and regular men could afford iron swords. The democratization of technology had begun. On the coast of the Levant, in modern-day Lebanon, a group of survivors known as the Phoenicians stepped into the vacuum left by the collapse. Before the crisis, they had been minor maritime traders under the shadow of Egypt. But now, with no imperial navies to stop them, the Phoenicians became the undisputed masters of the sea. They built advanced ships, established trade colonies all across the Mediterranean, including the famous city of Carthage, and reconnected the fractured world. To make their massive trade networks efficient, they realized they couldn't waste time using the complex, elitist writing systems of the past, like Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform. So they invented a revolutionary new system, a phonetic alphabet, where each symbol represented a single sound. It was simple, easy to learn, and highly efficient. This Phoenician alphabet would eventually evolve into the Greek alphabet, the Latin alphabet, and the very letters you are reading right now. Further inland, in the highlands of Canaan, another small group of survivors began to coalesce into a distinct cultural and political identity. Free from the imperial taxes and military campaigns of Egypt and the Hittites, the small tribes of Israelites began to establish their own kingdom, setting the stage for the creation of Hebrew scripture and the birth of monotheism. The Bronze Age collapse was undoubtedly a human tragedy of epic proportions. Millions of people died of starvation, thousands of cities were burned, and centuries of artistic and scientific progress were wiped clean. But it was not the end of human history. It was a violent, necessary reset. The ash of the old world became the fertile soil from which the classic civilizations of Greece, Rome, Phoenicia, and Israel would grow. It proved that humanity, even when pushed to the absolute brink of total civilizational failure, will always find a way to reinvent itself.
The story of the Bronze Age collapse is more than just a fascinating historical detective story. It is a mirror. It forces us to look at the grand monuments of our own time and ask a terrifying question. Could this happen to us? For over 3,000 years, we looked back at the ancient world and assumed that progress is always linear, that human civilization only goes forward, getting smarter, richer, and more advanced with each passing century. The Bronze Age collapse shatters that illusion. It is a brutal reminder that civilization is not a permanent state of nature. It is a fragile, highly complex artificial construct. And if you stress it hard enough, in the right places, it can completely unravel in less than a generation. When we look at our modern world in the 21st century, we like to think we are fundamentally different from the ancient Egyptians, Hittites, or Mycenaeans. We have the internet, satellite communications, global logistics, and advanced medicine.
But if a Bronze Age king were to look at our world today, he wouldn't see something alien. He would recognize it instantly. He would see a hyper-connected, globalized economy. He would see a world that relies entirely on a just-in-time supply chain. Think about how a modern smartphone is built. The cobalt is mined in the Congo. The chips are manufactured in Taiwan using machines made in the Netherlands. The software is written in California, and the final product is assembled in China before being shipped across the ocean to a store near you. This is the exact same vulnerability that doomed the Bronze Age. We are just as dependent on our modern equivalents of tin and copper, whether that means microchips, rare earth metals, or crude oil. We saw a tiny, terrifying preview of this vulnerability during the supply chain crises of the early 2020s. A single container ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal for just 6 days halted an estimated $9.6 billion worth of trade per day, causing shipping delays and economic ripples across the globe. A microscopic virus shut down factories, emptied supermarket shelves, and pushed modern states to their absolute limits.
The lesson of 1177 BCE is that systems don't usually collapse because of one single catastrophe. A healthy civilization can survive a drought. It can survive a war. It can survive a financial crisis or a political rebellion. The real danger is the perfect storm. When a severe climate crisis occurs at the exact same moment that international trade lanes are disrupted, while simultaneous economic inflation ruins the middle class, and weak, out-of-touch political leadership fails to adapt, that is when the dominoes begin to fall. When multiple stressors trigger a systemic failure, the very complexity that made a civilization powerful becomes the engine of its destruction. The ruins of Hattusa, the charred stones of Mycenae, and the desperate clay tablets of Ugarit are not just relics of a forgotten past. They are a warning, left behind by people who were just as smart, ambitious, and certain of their survival as we are today. They built empires they thought would last forever. They were wrong. As we look out at our own modern horizon, navigating our own changing climate, shifting geopolitics, and fragile economic networks, we would do well to remember the faceless scribe of Ugarit, who baked his final words into clay as the smoke closed in. Our city is sacked. May you know it. Civilization is a privilege, not a guarantee. And the line between a golden age and a dark age is much, much thinner than we think.